Hey, I'm Shaye Wanner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you are a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Folks, today we are visiting with Gary Tiller about how to get the most out of virtual fencing. Gary extensively explains the different benefits ranchers are experiencing with this technology and how they can even work with their local NRCS organization to potentially access this technology. This is a very extensive and jam-packed episode, but it's not a lengthy one. So I'm excited to hear and see all the value that you get out of this as listeners. With that, let's visit with Gary. Gary, it is a pleasure to have you on the show today, and I am excited to talk about all things Vence and virtual fence to help ranchers better understand the technology and if it's going to be a fit for their operation. To lead off this conversation and help everyone get to know you a little more, I'm curious why you bet on the beef industry each day.
Thank you, Shaye, for giving us the opportunity to visit with you about this. Virtual fence is a very exciting new technology, and we think it's got a lot of potential. I would say, to answer your question, globally, we at Merck Animal Health, we believe that the cattle industry is in a strong position for growth. You know, you say, why? Well, there's a finite amount of grazing and range lands available. While in some cases consumption per capita might be dropping, there's still a lot of people born every day that love to eat meat. And so we believe that over the long haul, the demand for pounds of beef will continue to grow, and at the same time, the available land to raise that beef is going to be limited, right? Mm-hmm. And so for us, we've started looking at technologies that would enable us to be competitive, not just next year, 5 years, 10 years, but decades down the road. And one of those that we looked at was virtual fencing. And we think that virtual fencing has that potential just to revolutionize the cattle industry globally, and also to position Merck Animal Health as a leader in that next sort of cutting edge of where the industry is going. Specific to virtual fencing, we believe that virtual fencing will allow producers, no matter where you are on the globe, to more efficiently utilize the grass that you currently have. The output of that would be greater stocking densities, being able to produce more pounds of beef per acre. But also at the same time, it allows you to gain access and potentially utilize land that historically maybe you weren't able to. If you take the western United States as an example, there's a lot of big open rangeland that it's just impractical to be able to fence that with conventional 4 or 5 strand barbed wire. And so as a result, that land just goes underutilized. Well, virtual fencing will change that. Virtual fencing will now allow you to, as a rancher or as a cattle producer, to access and unlock grazing lands and to use them more efficiently. So we believe that as we look to the future, just land availability is going to be an issue, and virtual fencing will help solve that. Secondarily to that, we know that all over rural America, labor is becoming more and more of an issue. And at the same time, as we have less and less land available for cattle production, we also have the need to be more intensive in our efforts with fewer labor options. And so we think virtual fencing will also help on that side as well. Whether that is just the cost of rolling and unrolling fence, whether that's the time and effort need to maintain a permanent fence, that is to us another opportunity for the use of virtual fencing. Gathering times. We already have a lot of evidence from folks that utilize the virtual fencing as a way to sort of automatically gather cattle. They can push those lines and bring those cattle into whatever trap that they want to bring them to. It takes less labor to do that. And at the same time, because each collar has a GPS monitor, they're able to actually see where every cow is on the place. And so even if they do have cattle that may not get caught up in the gathering, they know exactly where to send folks. So the time saving is tremendous.
And remind me, or share with the listeners, what is your role with Vence today?
Yeah, today I am the commercial director for Vence globally. I'm responsible for a sales, marketing, and customer service team in the United States, as well as a small team in Australia as well.
Okay. Now, you mentioned a lot of great benefits there in that first response. I mean, you talked about better utilizing the land, increasing stock and density, that labor savings and saving time there. But from your perspective and what you are seeing with ranchers who adopt this technology, what is the main draw for people who are adopting virtual fence?
The draw to virtual fencing with ranchers is very individualistic depending on what the ranch goals are. The common draw is production efficiency, but the question really comes down to what does production efficiency mean for that specific ranch? And that could be increased stocking density, that could be exclusion from sensitive areas that allow you to access conservation payments. That could also be the ability to rotate and rest pastures. So one of the uses that we find more and more across the western U.S. is the use of virtual fencing to manage the fuel loads on pastures, especially during high-risk times during fire. And then we also see a lot of wildlife and conservation around it. Virtual fencing becomes a really good tool to keep cattle out of sensitive nesting areas during the right times. And at the same time, if that rancher is utilizing things like prescribed burning, the ability to really control the level at which the grass is when you burn really gives that rancher a tool to manage that land very efficiently. The other area is one we talked about earlier, and that is sort of how you divide up your labor. If you can utilize virtual fencing to reduce some of the more mundane challenges and jobs on the ranch and move those hands to higher value activities, then that also benefits the ranch.
Well, one thing that comes to mind for me, I don't know the exact number or even a ballpark statistic on how many grazable lands that are actually rented per se instead of owned acres, but I think anytime that you can better utilize that input cost, I mean, even if you own it, it's an input too, but I just think about even some of our own rented pastures and how it'd be nice to, we don't really want to put in all the inputs and work to cross fence them necessarily, because you have to work with the landlord obviously on that. But if you have virtual fence and that opportunity, that opens up a lot of doors to better utilize that resource.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the primary areas that we see, and not just rental of private property to manage your cattle, but we're starting to see just from the government perspective, the opportunity to open more rangeland to folks on Forest Service properties or BLM properties is increasing dramatically, because now there is a tool to be able to manage those pastures and manage the boundaries and manage the cattle through these public lands as well.
Well, and even I had Jessie Jarvis on the show a few months back to talk about her experience with it, and they had experienced some burns on some BLM land that they used, and this technology was basically the saving grace so that they could still utilize what was not burned and didn't have to sell off a bunch of their cows.
Yeah, and that's a real sea change at the agencies. They have really adopted these tools and started to see them as a valuable, really a land management tool versus just a cattle management tool. And we have Jesse, and there's many various other people who've been able to utilize virtual fencing to either keep their allotments completely or to be able to utilize partial pieces of the allotment, which before now they were unable to do.
Is anything in the works with like something similar to like the EQIP program where this technology could be made available through that, because there is the conservation piece tied to it, or that's a major benefit?
Yeah, so actually at the federal level, the NRCS has already enabled the states to utilize virtual fencing under both EQIP and through the conservation payments. And so, interestingly, just because the federal government has made it available and funded it, doesn't necessarily mean at the state level it's been implemented. So what we would recommend is whatever state you're in, if you're interested, the way to get more funding for these EQIP programs for virtual fencing is to reach out to your local conservation folks, to reach out to your NRCS RangeCon and ask about it. And what I would say is today we've probably got a half a dozen states just in the last 6 months who've really upped the amount of monies they're dedicating toward virtual fencing through eQuip. And it's simply because of the demand from the people in the local conservation districts.
So, Gary, we've talked a lot about the benefits of virtual fencing, why a lot of ranchers are turning to it and using it. But can you explain a little bit more about how this technology works?
Yeah, so there are probably I would say there are four mainstream producers of virtual fencing today in the United States. And each one of our technologies operates slightly different than the other. I can't speak for them, but I can speak for the way our system operates. And today, our system has three components. It has a base station, which is basically a communications hub that allows the callers to speak through the base station, be uploaded to the cloud, and come back to your software. So that's the first piece of it. It's a LoRaWAN system, and it's a base station, and it's a piece of communications equipment. The second piece of the system is the actual collar that fits on the animal. And the collar has a lot of electrical components, from a GPS unit to the stimulus units for sound and pulse. And what it does is allows you as the user to determine your virtual boundaries. And then those instructions are loaded into each collar individually so that they operate autonomously. And then the final piece of the system is the software. And when you bring it all together, the software is a maps-based system that allows you to basically click and drag and create the virtual pastures. And you can create multiple virtual pastures, and you can even time your pasture moves in advance if you'd like. So that's basically how the system works.
And what does the onboarding process look like for that? I mean, do ranchers have a lot of support with that? How long does it take to get onboarded and set up? Can you walk us through that?
So onboarding has a few components to it, and it will take upwards, to a week or more. So the first piece of the onboarding would be to actually get your base stations up and running and in the right place to create the communication network to cover your ranch. Once that's accomplished, the second piece of it would be your software training. And we have a team of rancher success people that are skilled at that. And you as a rancher will be assigned your own individual person that will work with you throughout your journey, not only on onboarding, but through the years and as you make adjustments to your grazing management plan. And that person will help you with your software. And then there's the actual collaring phase where collars are placed on the animal. Our collars are very intuitive and not very difficult to install. In fact, can be done generally at the same speed of processing. And then finally, once the collars are on, the animals have to go through a 4-day training period. And that training period comprises having those animals the best case is to have them in a pen that is relatively large in size, that has 4 boundary fences. You would put your virtual fencing in place over top of that so that the cows, as they walk up to the fence, they'll get the beep and the pulse, and they'll begin associating a hard fence with the beep and the pulse. Once they've done that, we can see that clearly in the data. We'll start creating cross fences within that small pasture. And when the cattle start honoring the beep and the pulse without having the visual reference of a barbed wire fence per se, then we move to the next set of training pieces, and that's just to use the beep. And once we see that all the cows will respond to the audible cue and honor the virtual fence, you're trained. And that takes about 4 days on average. Occasionally, we may have to stretch it a day or two, just depending on how your area is set up. And then the great thing about it is once those cows are trained the first time, they will remember forever. So the next season doesn't really require any additional training. They're ready to go.
Is this something where, with your model, are producers renting the collars? Are they purchasing the collars? What does that look like?
So we offer a subscription. So we have an annual subscription, and that would include the collar and the battery, and that's basically $50 a year. So $4 a cow, $4.11 a cow per month. Yeah, so if there's anything, unlike some of our competitors where it's a purchase up front. We prefer our subscription model because it allows us to provide you the next gen equipment. Anytime we have an upgrade in equipment, because you're on a subscription, you'll get the most latest and greatest in terms of equipment.
And how have the collars advanced in the past years? How are they being upgraded?
Yeah, so our initial collars, they had some issues around water intrusion, primarily because when we engineered it, our first fear was that they would overheat given all the electronic components. And that actually did not come to fruition, but by allowing venting, we also allowed moisture to get in, which that became a bigger issue. So on our first generation of collars, we identified that, and then we made the changes, and we continue to make changes pretty much every year, whether it's in software or hardware, as we identify something that makes the rancher's life easier. And we get a lot of feedback from ranchers. As soon as we identify something that is of an inconvenience and there's a way to solve that, then we will implement that and pass it on to the next generation of our ranchers.
All right. So I have a question about the software side. You mentioned that with that software, ranchers can essentially just go in there and draw their boundaries and even progressively gather their herd and move them closer to a trap or the home place, whatever their setup is. What other benefits or functions come with this software? I mean, are there additional functionalities of it, or is it primarily just the GPS aspect where they can see where their animals are and being able to draw those maps?
It is primarily that. It is primarily the ability to visually know where your animals are at any given time, to create your virtual pastures. You do have a function which is very nice where you can roll back time. So if you don't have time to be looking daily or even weekly at your software, you can roll back time and then see based on a heat map where your cattle are grazing within a given pasture, which is very interesting in and of itself because most pastures will have areas of higher nutritional value in the grass and lower nutritional value in the grass. And what we've seen is the cattle are automatically going to go to the higher nutrition grasses and sometimes may never go into the lower nutrition grasses, which is really what's helpful about the tool because it allows you now to see areas where your overall pasture is being underutilized. And once you see that, you can then create your next virtual fence to keep those animals contained in an area that you want them to go ahead and clean up that grass. And sometimes it's a low area or a high area or just a different type of a soil content, and it just leads to just differences in proteins and sugars and grasses. And cows are pretty good at picking the good stuff.
They are. They're smarter than we give them credit for a lot of days. Maybe not always during calving season.
No, but that's the other thing, right? I mean, during calving season, if you've got the collars on, you actually know where the cows are, and you can see by the way they split off from the herd. You have a really good idea in real time which cows are calving and where they're at.
Awesome. So what would you say is the main reason producers shy away from this technology? Because there are so many benefits to it, but what is the main reason producers shy away or maybe decide it's not a fit for their operation?
I think in general, folks in agriculture are always a little bit shy about change, right? And so I think generally when we talk to people that are considering virtual fence, it's that change element because literally you are changing a paradigm on the way cattle potentially have been grazed for years to a paradigm where there really are very few rules and you're kind of limited by what your imagination is. And that's a lot of what we see is that the folks right up front are going to be a little bit hesitant about the change. For the early adopters, they jump right in. It's really been an interesting product to watch because one of the common feedbacks we hear from folks is, I thought I knew what my cows were doing. I didn't really know what my cows were doing until I could reverse history and watch what they did on a daily basis. And so I think that's the big, I would call it the epiphany moment for a lot of people is, hey, I now realize I've got the ability to manage my cattle differently. I've got my ability to do things completely different. And for some people, that can be a daunting task, right? Just mentally getting your head around having the complete flexibility to do things completely different.
Yeah, change is hard, even for people who can be innovative.
And I'll tell you this, the other thing that's been really interesting about this is you can't put people in a box in terms of who's going to adopt the technology and who's not. Because we see 75 and 80-year-olds who jump on this and just adopt it and embrace it. And we see 20-year-olds who are hesitant because that's not the way they learned it from dad and granddad. And so that's been a really interesting finding, has been that what you might have as a bias in terms of age and technology adoption really doesn't exist with this product.
That's really interesting, actually, because you would think it'd be the other way around, but yeah.
You really would. And that's not to say that once they adopt it, they don't bring in the younger generation, the next generation coming up to run the system for them. But it's just been very interesting to see there is no rules about who's going to adopt it and who's not.
Yeah. Now, I always say with each technology or product, it's not going to be right for everyone. So what questions do you encourage ranchers to ask themselves to figure out if virtual fence is the right technology for their operation and is going to solve some of their problems?
Well, we've touched on it. I think the very first question is we like to be able to figure out whether that technology is a fit for that person. And part of that is there a willingness to spend the time to learn it? Secondarily to that is once you adopt this technology, some of the infrastructure within your ranch may not be right for the technology. So you may have to rethink water, as an example. A lot of the ranches in the country today, the fences are there because that's where they've been for 75, 100 years, right? And when you enter the world of virtual fencing, you really have to imagine having no fences, and then what would you do with that property, and how would you manage it if you could start all over?
All right. Gary, is there anything else that you think is important to this conversation that we have not yet touched on?
Yeah, I do. I think the other big feedback that we get from folks are the intangibles. The ranching business and the cow-calf business is a very cash flow driven business. And so the first thing that most folks want to go to is that cost benefit ratio. And I think the thing that's been most interesting is initially you use a cost benefit ratio looking at the inputs and costs that you have been used to using, right? And what's interesting with what happens over time in this journey is how much value you place on the intangibles, right? And one of the intangibles, I mean, we hear this all the time, like this was the first year we were able to take a family vacation since the kids were born, because literally I can be sitting on a beach in Florida, pull up my iPad, and I can see that all 675 cows are in this pasture and the 200 heifers are in this pasture, and everybody's doing what they're supposed to. And I have that peace of mind knowing where my cows are and what they're doing, that I don't have to be physically on the ranch to do that, which is historically what's had to happen, right? So we hear a lot of first vacation. Now I'm able to go to the softball games. Now I'm able to go to the basketball tournaments. And I think that's the piece that's been really, really cool to learn about ourselves, right?
Absolutely. They could even move their cows from Florida on vacation.
They absolutely can, and that's what's the beauty of it. And if you got a cow escape, you can just call your hand and let him know, hey, got 2 cows out over here, and we need to run and get them, right? So it is very, very interesting to see that intangible, how much value is starting to be placed on that.
So one thing we didn't touch on, and I mean, I've talked about it in other conversations about virtual fence. This isn't the first time the topic has come on the podcast, but I mean, the collars go on the cows. They don't go on the bulls and calves, correct?
That's correct. They're primarily a cow tool.
And when you think about the cows, are the majority of them respectful of those boundaries, or are there some that still escape, or do signals get kind of messed up where maybe the collars don't work? I mean, what's the effectiveness, I guess, or the reliability of the technology?
So I think with any virtual fencing technology, I think all companies recommend a good solid boundary fences, right? Good fences make good neighbors. And so that's not an area that we would recommend you utilize virtual fencing as your sole boundary between properties or even on a highway or something like that. The real value comes in the ability to manage and cross fence internally. So I think that's the first thing. I think the other thing is that, your cow herd hasn't changed. So even with the use of virtual fencing, most ranches have that cow that knows how to get out of the barbed wire fence. Will never honor just a 18 gauge electric fence, right? So you either figure out how to manage those cows out or manage them differently, or you move that cow out of the herd. And so it's really virtual fence is what I like to say is, for thousands of years we've been managing cattle, and first we stacked rocks, and then we had poles, and then we had barbed wire, and then we had electric fence, and virtual fencing is just the next iteration of containment. Every one of those types of containment has their strengths and weaknesses.
All right. Well, Gary, as we wrap up today, this is a more personal question for you. We've talked a lot about what you do for your job and virtual fence itself, but I'm curious I always like to hear this perspective from everyone. If you could go back to your first 5 years in your career, what would you do differently?
Yeah, my first 5 years were interesting because this also kind of goes to something we've seen lately, and that is the cattle cycles used to be fairly predictable. Today, I don't know that we've had as predictable of cattle cycles, just given the weather situation and stuff like that. And for me, as I was leaving college looking for that first sort of ranch job, cattle job, I hit the very bottom of the down cycle. So I spent probably 5 years working for a chicken company as I was waiting for my opportunity to move back into cattle. And so the first 5 years wasn't exactly what I thought I wanted to do, but I will say this, it was an eye-opening experience because chicken production did teach me to step back and see things at a much more enterprise level. And I think that's probably helped me more throughout my career is being able to look at the businesses holistically and not necessarily get as caught up in the day-to-day functions and look at more at the annual 5 years, 10-year plans. And so, if I could do it differently, I would have jumped into the fun stuff first. I didn't, but I think overall it has been much more valuable to me in my career over time just by having a different perspective and being able to look at agriculture differently. It's a great technology. It's very interesting, and I think we see daily more and more interest in it. I mean, literally daily. And as this NRCS thing gets kicked off, I think it's really you're going to see a huge uptake in the amount of virtual fencing being used. They struggle a little bit because NRCS is an organization that's used to counting poles and rolls of wire. And when you're suddenly creating that same system without poles and wire, they struggled up front trying to figure out how they would manage that. And as they have gained more experience this year and next year and the year after, I think you're going to see a huge uptake in this product just because they're more comfortable and understand how it can be used.
Well, Gary, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to visit with myself and share this insight with my listeners out there. For anyone interested in more information about this technology or getting in contact with someone at Vence to learn more, there will be links and resources in the descriptions of the podcast. Now, remember, the best way to support this podcast and all your favorite podcasts is to leave a rating and review, and more importantly, share it with a friend who's going to find some value in it. With that, happy ranching, folks.